Now, wizards, let's continue to look at expanding frontiers of European settlements. The Third Frontier War in 1799 to 1803 was fought under the British. The Xhosa and Khoikhoi, who had been working for the Dutch settlers, together chased most of the settlers out of the Zouveld. The Western Xhosa under Chief Ndlambe were then in control of most of the Zouveld. In 1803, the Cape was given back to the Dutch as part of a peace treaty agreed on in Europe between the Netherlands and Britain. The Dutch were able to make peace with the Xhosa who were settled in the Zouveld, but the peace in Europe did not last for long. In 1806, the Cape became a British colony again. The Cape remained a British colony for another 100 years. Frontier wars on the eastern frontier of European settlements. There were more than 8,000 Xhosa-speaking farmers living in the Zouveld, and just a few families of white settlers. Wizards, the British wanted to force the Xhosa to leave the fertile land of the Zouveld. The British realized the Xhosa were too powerful and that they would need to use a large army if they wanted to force the Xhosa out. In the 100 years from 1779 to 1879, there were 9 frontier wars between the Cape Colony and the Xhosa. The Xhosa, under a series of chiefs, fought fiercely to defend their land, but in the end, they were dispossessed of their land by the superior weapons of the British. Now let's look at soldiers and officials. When the British took over the Cape, they brought with them soldiers and officials to govern the colony. The most important official was the governor, who had to report to the government in Britain. The chief military wizards was in charge of the army in the Cape Colony, was made up of different groups of soldiers called regiments. There were regiments of soldiers from Britain, of Britain colonists, Khoikhoi soldiers, and farmer settlers who were part-time soldiers. Looking at tension between the British and trekbouers of the frontier wizards. There was tension between the British government and some of the trekbouers, farmers on the eastern frontier on the Cape Colony. Circuit courts were introduced by the British government. Khoikhoi servants could make complaints about ill-treated about their white employers at a circuit court. Now, wizards, some of the trekbouers referred to this as a black circuit, as they thought the British court was biased against them. Cornelius Bezuidenhout was a trekbouer farmer in the Eastern Cape Colony. Wizards, in 1815, his Khoi servant complained to the circuit court that Cornelius had not paid him. He refused to appear before the circuit court. 2 British officers and Khoi soldiers were sent to arrest him. Cornelius fired shots at the soldiers. The soldiers fired back and shot him dead. After his funeral, Cornelius' brother organized a rebellion against British authority at Ss.His.Gr7.T4.L1.2. There were only 60 rebels who surrendered without a shot being fired. After being sentenced, 4 of the leaders were hanged.